This talk is Radar, the Eyes of the Few, and it's by a fine Sussex gentleman, Graham Murchie, G4FSG, a joke that we've shared for a number of years. The talk will cover a brief history of early radar and the events leading up to the development of a viable system and the establishment of the world's first operational radar station at Bawdsey. It focuses on the people involved and the alternatives considered, together with the impact on the Battle of Britain. Graham Murchie, G4FSG, operates on VHF and microwaves, with most activity on 6 metres, 4 metres and 2 metres. He was a member of the RSGB Board for 5 years, 4 of which he was chairman of the board, and I must say it was a privilege to serve with him. He also chaired the RSGB Convention Committee for 6 years. He has been a trustee of Bawdsey Radar Trust for 5 years, for one of which he was the chair. So over to you, Graham, please.
Thank you very much, Stuart. I enjoyed working with you as well. So there we are, Mutual Admiration Society. Okay, as Stuart said, I am going to be talking about the history of radar. I'm not particularly going to cover technical issues. If you ask technical questions, no problem. I will refer them to Dr. Worsnop over there, who is on after me. He will answer all the technical questions. So I'm going to be covering why radar, where it was developed, how it was developed, the people who developed it. So why did we need radar? Well, during the First World War, for the very first time, people who were not on the front line of a battle were getting killed. The Germans were bombing the east coast of England. They couldn't get much further inland. Bear in mind that the Wright brothers first had the powered flight only 11 years before the start of the First World War. And the Blériot only crossed the Channel and crash landed only 3 years before the start of the First World War. So the first bombs were dropped on Britain by airships, not aircraft. Picture here of Felixstowe, which was attacked, in fact, by an aircraft in 1917, latter towards the end of the First World War. But what stuck in the minds of politicians and civil servants and military people was the fact that a month before this, in June 1917, 14 Goethe German bombers attacked London. 162 people were killed, many of them children, because there was a direct hit on a school, and 432 were injured. But what really stuck in the minds was the fact that of those 14 bombers, every single one of them got back to base totally unscathed. So there was significant concern some 15 years later, when the Nazi Party were beginning to come to power, that there might be another war. And Stanley Baldwin, former Prime Minister, but actually acting Prime Minister because Ramsay MacDonald was unwell, made the statement in the Commons, "The bomber will always get through," based on what had happened during the First World War. So what had changed between 1917, 1918 and the early 30s? Well, what hadn't changed was geography. It was still only just over 20 miles between the continent and the UK. But planes could fly faster, they could fly higher, and they could carry heavier bomb loads. So how were we going to defend the country against these attacks, or the potential attacks? Well, the first idea was we will listen for the engines. So some of you may have seen some of these still exist on the Kent coast, Romney Marshes, etc. One on the right, over 200 feet long. One on the left, parabola-ish, John, ish, but only ish. The idea was that let me try this. The microphone would be at the focus there on that shepherd's crook, and down below would be a man wearing his headphones connected to the microphone, and he would listen for the sound of the engines. and on a good day he might hear the engines, but as I said, the speed of the aircraft had increased significantly, and quite often during the tests the aircraft had passed overhead before they could be observed. So even though these were only tests, we didn't know potentially whether they were friendly or whether they were foe. So not all that successful. And then of course the wind might blow or the sea might be rough, and guess what? You can't hear engines when the wind blows or the sea is rough. And there's a classic story of an Air Ministry observer who went to see these concrete ears in action, and what did he hear? He heard glass milk bottles in a metal crate as a milk float drove down an adjacent road. So not all that successful. Move on a couple of years. Winston Churchill, not in power at the time, but did sit on a number of influential House of Commons committees. Churchill couldn't manage with the words, "the bomber will always get through." He had to be somewhat more verbose. "The flying peril is not a peril we can fly from. We cannot move London. We shall have to face this peril, whatever it may be, where we stand." And Churchill was seriously influential in getting the focus, because he was convinced that Hitler was going to attack in Europe and at the UK. So he was very influential as time progressed, even before he became Prime Minister. So we've got politicians, we've got civil servants worrying and concerned about something. So when you've got politicians and civil servants concerned about something, what do? Well, it's obvious. You form a committee. The Committee for the Air Defence of the UK was led by Sir Henry Tizard. Tizard was an academic in that he was rector of Imperial College, but he was also a very pragmatic individual. He had been asked during the First World War, for example, to produce a paper on how pilots should drop bombs. Initially, they waited till they were over the top of the target, let go, and guess what? The bombs missed. So Tizard said, well, I don't understand aerodynamics, I don't understand flying, so what did he do? He learned to fly. Having learned to fly, studied aerodynamics, he produced an appropriate paper that towards the end of the war taught pilots how to drop bombs. He was also asked to find a location for a new aircraft experimental station. Remember, aircraft, early stages of their lives, and there are lots of experimental work going on. He scoured the countryside, and where did he choose? He chose Martlesham Heath, just to the east of Ipswich, as the site for the experimental station. But he put together this committee who formed from a number of worthies, but fairly pragmatic worthies. The secretary to the committee was A.P. Rowe, who made the statement, unless science could evolve some new method of aiding air defence, we were likely to lose the war if it started within the next 10 years. And we, of course, have got hindsight. We know the war started only 5 years later. So, Tizard Committee started looking at how we could defend the country. Meanwhile, the Air Ministry were getting quite concerned. They were thinking of all sorts of different things, and they'd heard rumours that the Germans were experimenting with death rays. So they put up a prize of £1,000 to the first person who could kill a sheep at 100 yards. So the Tizard Committee were not at all convinced that this was particularly viable. So they asked Robert Watson Watt, who was a Scottish physicist, worked at the Met Office at the time, and his job was to detect where thunderstorms were using radio detection techniques. Watson Watt, having been asked by the Tizard Committee about this death ray, being a good manager, immediately asked his technical assistant to look at whether this was viable or not. Arnold Wilkins, known as Skip Wilkins, took a remarkably short time to work out that to kill a sheep at 100 yards, you needed more power than the whole of the UK generated at the time. So you'll be pleased to hear that not only were no sheep killed in the course of the experiment, but the Air Ministry saved £1,000. which was worth quite a lot of money in the 1930s. But Wilkins said, well, hang on a minute, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to kill sheep? Are we trying to kill pilots? No, we're actually trying to detect the presence of aircraft. So he remembered he'd read a paper written by a GPO engineer who was responsible for a receiving station just to the north of London. And in this paper, the GPO engineer had complained that whenever an aircraft flew near to his receiving station, the signal got distorted. So Wilkins thought, aircraft, radio, distortion, surely we can do something with this. So he and Watson Watt put together a paper which went as a memorandum to the Air Ministry, and I've put the exact date in there, the 12th of February 1935. And that's included for a good reason, because exactly 2 weeks later, the Air Ministry had received the paper, read the paper, assimilated the paper, decided it was a viable option. They had authorised an experiment. They had authorised the flying of a Hayford bomber as part of that experiment, and that's gone forward too many? No, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry, that's where we should be. Jim Bacon had trouble with this morning. So 26th of February 1935, as I say, 14 days later, the experiment took place. Now, 14 days for Air Ministry to make a decision. I would suggest to you that these days, let's take HS2, or let's take Sizewell C, 14 years, maybe a bit closer. But seriously, back to the point, on the horizon here, you can just about see, not particularly well on the screen, but that was the Daventry 49-metre shortwave transmitter, the BBC transmitter at Daventry. A few miles away in the field, Wilkins and a technical assistant in the back of that old ambulance, which is what it was, in the muddy field near Weedon, erected, and because you're a technical audience, there are two sets of aerials there rather than an aerial. One was to null out the ground wave, and the other was to receive the reflected wave. So the Hayford bomber flew backwards and forwards between the transmitter and the receiver. Now, I don't know whether the story was added afterwards, but the wingspan of the Hayford bomber is roughly 25 metres. Transmitter was on 49 metres. Half wave-ish, maybe, don't know. But that's part of the story. But the idea was to test whether you could detect aircraft, and you could. So the Air Ministry decided that this was a viable way forward. Now, digressing very slightly, this was the receivers, two of them, because two aerials, in the back of that old ambulance. It's now in the Science Museum in London. On the right-hand picture, the white blob top right, is the oscilloscope that they used to measure the signal wobbling up and down as the aircraft went through the beam. Left-hand picture is the rear view. Now, as radio amateurs, you will all, no doubt, polish your copper components in your equipment on a regular basis. I can assure you that in the middle of February, in the damp and wet of that field in the Midlands, those copper components were not shining like that. The conservators at the Science Museum got a bit carried away before they took that picture. So, the Air Ministry authorised the spending of £12,000, and 4 scientists were sent to Orford, Ness. Now, some of you might know Orford, Ness. It is bleak, it is miserable. Technically, it's not an island, but you can only reach it by ferry. And the scientists were allocated a building last used at the end of the First World War, some 15 years earlier. It had no power, etc., etc. But they did progress remarkably quickly. in terms of developing the detection, and before very long they could detect aircraft about 40 miles out. The reason they could do that was because they adopted what Robert Watson Watt called the cult of the imperfect. And you as amateurs will recognise this. Give them the third best to go on with, the second best comes too late, and the best never comes. They were encouraged not to build it into nice, neat boxes, etc. Most of the work was done with things spread all over the bench, and it worked remarkably quickly because of that. It also worked because the one textbook they had between them was the RSGB handbook. So, and that's, if you read the autobiographies, a couple of them mention that. But it was not a good place to work. It was damp, it was miserable on the Ness. They had to travel backwards and forwards each morning and night because there was no living accommodation. So early 1936, the Air Ministry spent £24,000 and bought Bawdsey Manor together with 186 acres. Bawdsey Manor was built by Sir Cuthbert Quilter, a stockbroker, as his holiday home. In the 1880s, 1890s. Because he was a stockbroker, he made lots of money. Oh, by the way, he was an MP part-time as well. But he made lots of money each year, and depending on how much money he made, he would build a new wing onto the manor. And architects love this building because they argue amongst themselves whether there are 5 or 7 different architectural styles in the one building. Can't see it from this picture, but we've been doing some drone footage recently, and you can see various different architectural styles there. What you can also see, by the way, is how close the sea is getting to the manor. And that part's protected. Our museum, which was on the early slide, isn't protected in quite the same way, and the sea is beginning to move closer and closer. So they moved. The other thing about Cuthbert Quilter, he owned the local telephone company. Many of you will know that prior to 1912, all telephone companies were private, and because Cuthbert Quilter owned the telephone company, Bawdsey Manor boasted the telephone number Woodbridge 1. So engineers, scientists, they got a snooker room, they got a swimming pool, they could live and work in the same building, great environment. And they continued to progress very rapidly to the extent that within a few months they were detecting aircraft at 100 miles. And so at that point the Air Ministry authorised the building of the first 5 operational radar stations. Here is one I prepared earlier. So that is a model of one of the transmitting towers. Come back to exactly what they are. They were 360 feet high. So if I'm on a scale with this, I am 1 inch high on this scale. Hands up, all you radio amateurs with huge aerial arrays, how many of you have got towers 360 feet high, let alone 4 of them? None of you. What a grave disappointment you are. So each operational radar station, they had a transmitter housed in the block that I showed on my opening slide. Each transmitter had 4 360-foot lattice steel masts. The receiver station was about a quarter of a mile away in an identical concrete building, and they only had 4 240-foot lattice wooden towers. 22 sites, the first 5, Bawdsey was number 1. There was one at Canewdon in Essex, one at Bromley in Essex, one at Dunkirk in Kent, and one at Dover in Kent. And they were the first 5 built in around 1937, early 38. But by September 39, the beginning of the war, there were 22 sites covering the south coast and the east coast of Britain. And by 1942, there were 45 radar stations covering the whole of the coastline of the UK. But it's all very well an operator at Bawdsey on the coast of Suffolk or someone on the coast of Essex or Kent knowing that there is an incoming aircraft or incoming number of aircraft. That's not a lot of use if you can't get that information to anywhere sensible. So a command and control system was needed. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding was appointed head of fighter command in 1936. He realised the benefits of radar and he put in place the command and control system that became known as the Dowding system. It connected each and every radar station by fixed telephone line to fighter command. It also connected each and every Royal Observer Corps post, or Observer Corps as they were in 1939, to Bentley Priory. Because at the time, radar was brilliant at looking out to sea, and as I say, could detect aircraft 100 miles out. What it was pretty useless at was looking inland because of ground reflections, etc. at the time. So there were fixed lines connecting to Bentley Priory. Those of you that have seen the Battle of Britain film will know that you'll have seen the pictures of the WAAFs moving the markers around on the map boards. Well, the information they were getting into their headphones was from the radar stations and the Royal Observer Corps stations. So that's how the planes were tracked, and Bentley Priory were the ones that scrambled the Hurricanes and the Spitfires, etc. Now, I don't mean to insult anyone, but I'm going to show a video that I normally show irrespective of which audience it is, and most of my audiences are not technical. But I'm just going to run a 60-second video showing how radar worked and how it was used late 30s and early 40s. So bear with me, all of you people who understand technical things. Let's see if the video works and the audio works. Yes.
The principle is wonderfully simple. Imagine dropping a stone into a pond and watching the ripples spread outwards. When these hit an object on the pond's surface, the ripples bounce back towards the starting point. Like the ripples in the pond, pulses of radio waves are transmitted from an aerial, travelling at the speed of light. These bounce off a plane and can be picked up by a receiver. The time delay between the pulse leaving and coming back helps to identify the range. By measuring the slight time delay noted between two receiver aerials, you can also work out the aircraft's bearing. Watson Watts and his research team quickly improved the range and accuracy of their radar experiments and proved that approaching aircraft could be identified from many miles away.
Okay, most of you knew that, but it's always useful to show that because there is a reference to it in a later slide. So we've got a number of sites around the country, all with 360 foot and 240 foot towers. How do you explain these away? What are they? Worry the neighbours, you know about neighbours and masts and what have you, but equally worry the Germans are saying, what are these? Well, the story we put out at the time was that they were RDF stations. Towards the end of the First World War, we were using some very basic radio direction finding techniques to try and detect where the transmitters were in attacking aircraft or airships. After the First World War was over, the Germans discovered we'd been doing this. So we used this story that these were RDF stations, and the Germans actually fell for it because the maps we captured after the Second World War, the 1939 and 1940 maps, had got all radar stations around the coast marked as RDF stations. So they believed some of the story. And the term radar, radio detection and ranging, only came into use in 1942. So what about the receiver side of all of this? You'll see from this picture that the majority of the operators are women. Not all of them, but the majority, and over 7,000 have been trained by 1942 to be radar operators. Why? pure chance. Early on in the experiments, Robert Watson Watt had wanted someone to sit in front of the screens. The scientists and engineers were using the cult of the imperfect and constantly changing the transmitters, the receivers, the aerials, etc. And so Watson Watt borrowed, in inverted commas, 3 clerical secretaries from Bawdsey Manor who were providing support, and sat them in front of the screens, and very rapidly realised how good they were at doing this. And he wrote, and here I have to quote to get the words exactly right: "Their alertness, keenness of perception, delicacy of touch, and, immeasurably above all else, their conscientiousness is to a degree unobtainable in the men." And the Treasury agreed with him, but their version was, "Women are cheaper than men." And I know you can't say that now, but I'll tell you what, you could in the 1930s. But seriously, the women did a great job, personified by Corporal Avis Parsons, who was on duty on one of the South Coast radar stations during the Battle of Britain. The station was attacked by a Stuka dive bomber, so Avis reached under the bench, put her tin hat on, and continued feeding back the information to Bentley Priory. As a result of that, she was awarded the Military Medal. She went to Buckingham Palace to collect her medal, and the King said to her, "And what do you do?" And she replied, "I operate a telephone, Your Majesty." She and everyone else working on radar had been told, you must tell nobody about radar. And nobody, as far as Avis was concerned, included the King. So the secret was kept. One more point before I leave this slide. Whenever any operator arrived at a radar site in the early days, men or women, the first thing they were told to do, I stress told to do, was climb to the top of the 360-foot tower, because someone had to do the work on the aerials if they needed changing or repairing or whatever, and the men were busy with their cult of the imperfect on the transmitters and receivers. So we've got some brilliant oral histories recorded 20-25 years ago from operators who had been around at the time of the Battle of Britain. Oral histories about them being told to climb the tower, both men and women, and some of them are great to listen to. In the very early stages, the WAAFs were only issued with skirts, they weren't issued with trousers, and they held a view of their male colleagues of which of them were gentlemen by which of them would climb ahead of them on the tower rather than behind them on the tower. So what could they actually see on the screen? This is a composite, and it's very quickly. Scale 0 to 100 miles on the top left. You can see 2 dips on the left-hand side. They were the ground reflections that I briefly talked about earlier. But you can see there's a dip at 40 miles out. That showed there was an aircraft, or some aircraft, 40 miles distant. The operators very rapidly learned to interpret the shape of that dip to determine whether there's 1, 10, 50, or even 200 aircraft in an attacking group. Bottom left is the bearing. You remember 2 aerials side by side. The slight time difference determined the bearing. Bottom right, the height, not quite as simple, but basically 2 aerials, one above each other. The time difference, as I say, slightly more complicated than that, but that determined the height. So the operators were passing back distance, potential number of aircraft, bearing and height at a very regular basis back to fighter command. Why did it matter? Well, at the time of the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe outnumbered the RAF 4 planes to 1. 2,600 German planes, only 650 British planes. If we'd had to put up standing patrols to find incoming attacks, we would not have won the Battle of Britain. It was very, very close, and it was only because radar could vector our Hurricanes and Spitfires to the right place at the right time that we were successful in winning the Battle of Britain. As a result of which, Hitler had to abandon or postpone initially Operation Sea Lion, which was the potential invasion of Britain. and then he cancelled Sea Lion. Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, had promised Hitler in the spring of 1940 that Germany would control the skies over the English Channel and southeast England. Because of radar, that never came to fruition. So Hitler had to abandon his invasion, and here we are today. There's no doubt that radar saved the day. Summed up by Churchill, after the war, all the ascendancy of the Hurricanes and Spitfires would have been fruitless, but for this system, which had been devised and built before the war, the system being, of course, radar. I'm getting towards the end, but bear in mind, at the time, the system that I've talked about with the huge towers, etc., which was known as Chain Home, a chain of radar stations defending the home nations. Chain Home could only get our Spitfires and Hurricanes to within 3 or 4 miles of any attacking aircraft. If the weather was clear, it was great. If it was cloudy or if it was dark, they couldn't necessarily find the aircraft. So we had to try and get radar into aircraft. So airborne radar had to be devised in some way. Bear in mind the original systems, 360-foot towers, transmitters each weighed 6 tons, doesn't equate to aircraft. So the frequency had to change. The original tests, as I said earlier, were at 49 metres. Further developments took it down to 26 metres and then about 13 metres. And generally speaking, the chain home systems operated at the time of the Battle of Britain between about 20 megahertz and 40 megahertz. But to do anything in aircraft, they moved up to about 200 megahertz. Not a lot of power could be generated at the time at those frequencies. And the aerials were not that wonderful and the receivers were okay, but it needed scientists or engineers to operate the equipment, not your average RAF personnel at the time. But that all got so by the beginning of the war, towards the end of 39, we were just about able to detect aircraft using airborne radar. But the major change came in 1940 when John Randall and Harry Boot developed the cavity magnetron at the University of Birmingham. And this meant that the frequency went up by a couple of orders to 3 gigahertz. We could produce multiple kilowatts from a pretty tiny device. The reason I include this in my presentation, again, is for your average audience. I now ask the question, how many of you here in the audience own a cavity magnetron today? And you see, you as an audience, usually out of about an average of 40 in the audience, I get 2 or 3 hands from those who are technical. I then reverse the question by saying, okay, if you don't know whether you own a cavity magnetron, how many of you do not own a microwave oven? Because, of course, the cavity magnetron is what powers your microwave oven even today. So I tell people, when you go home and cook your meal tonight or tomorrow, remember radar, because it was the radar development program in 1940 that means you can cook your meal in a couple of minutes. So that's what radar does for you today, as well as a huge number of other things. I'm going to stop there. Back to the building. It's a grade 2-star listed concrete bunker, which poses a few problems. Those of you that know about listed buildings will know that that poses some challenge. So it now houses our museum. We're open Thursdays and Sundays to the 3rd of November this season, and then Thursdays and Sundays from Easter next year. Please come and see us. I'm in the midst of negotiating with some organisation called the Radio Society of Great Britain for potential discounts for RSGB members to come in. So if you wait till next year, you might get in cheaper, and that means you can buy even better rigs from the guys downstairs. So as I say, do come and see us. We are a charity. We depend very much on people coming and paying money to get in, or you can go onto the website and make a donation, or I go out and give these sorts of talks on a regular basis all around Suffolk, and people do make donations to us. So happy to take any questions. As I say, if you've got technical ones, Dr. Worsnop over there will answer them for you. Typical.